When it's done right, compositing can be one of the most time-consuming and challenging areas of photography, but it can open up a magical world of creativity as well. Today, I'm joined by composite artist James Popsys on this episode of Behind the Shot. Hi, once again, welcome to another episode of Behind the Shot. I'm your host, Steve Brazel. This is the podcast where we try and get inside the mind of great photographers by taking a closer look behind one of their shots, from conception to completion, and all the challenges and choices that a photographer makes in between. As always, you can find out more about the podcast and find past episodes at thisweekinphoto.com. And today's episode will also have an associated blog post, so you'll be able to see more of the artist's work and links to find this artist anywhere you want to on social media or on the internet. So with that in mind, let's move on to our guest today. Compositing is one of those things that I don't do. I mean, I've done it. I don't do it well. And the reason I don't do it well is because I'm probably the least patient person on earth. And to do compositing well, to do compositing really, in my opinion, the correct way, and I have friends who do this, and it just takes time and attention to detail. It's the old thing, you can mow your yard, but edging the yard makes it look good. And that's kind of the thing to me with compositing. I'd like to welcome James Popsys to the episode. How are you, James?
I'm very well, thank you, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing really, really good. I appreciate your coming on. You're UK based.
Yeah.
And in my notes, I have it that I was going to introduce you as a UK based photographer and digital composite artist. And the more I think about it, I'm kind of curious how you describe what you do, because you're not normal composites. You're almost like stand-up comedy composites.
Yeah, I mean, I've battled with some sort of title for a long time now, to the point where I've just given up, to be honest. I don't know what's gone off. So, yeah, photographer, I accept, along with, well, pretty much everything else, to be honest.
So, but really that's what you do is digital composites. You take photos, you composite them together to make interesting stories. I was looking through your description of yourself on your website, your About Me page. And I love the way you describe it. You say that your shots are, that yes, these ridiculous shots are what I love to do. And that's so wonderful and so refreshing that there's an artist of your caliber out there that doesn't just take themselves so seriously. You know what I mean? You're willing to have fun with it and understand that art is art. Yeah.
I mean, I think, like most people, I kind of started off with photography, taking it fairly seriously. I mean, my journey in photography started when I started doing bits of traveling with my girlfriend back in probably 2009, 2010. And at the time I was taking completely useless photos, pretty much. I mean, all of my photos consisted of photos of my girlfriend stood right in the middle of the frame with a smile, with a monument that we couldn't pronounce in the background that we'd never remember the details of. And that was pretty much all the images that I took. And slowly I kind of became a bit fed up with that being the case. And as I did more and more traveling over time, I decided that, I should dedicate a bit more time to taking some photos. So that's really what I did. I picked up I guess a point and shoot camera, but it was a point and shoot camera that had manual controls, and it didn't have a particularly bright lens. It didn't have a particularly big sensor, so I couldn't do an awful lot with it creatively, but it was my first sort of inlet into what was possible with photography. Fast forward a few months, I got back to the UK and moved to London with my girlfriend. And I was spending my weekends going out, trying to get kind of unique, original images.
Which in London, by the way, is not super easy, because everything in London has been photographed every way from Sunday.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the first, the first couple of weekends that I was trying it, I had my hopes held very high. But as you say, in any city full of 10 million people, an increasing percentage of those people have access to some kind of camera. Also, I just found it very difficult to find any kind of unique perspectives, particularly as a novice at that point, I didn't really know what I was doing with the camera. I was kind of shooting what I saw. And it got to a point where, I'd find something that I thought was relatively unique, or I certainly hadn't seen it before on Facebook or Flickr or wherever else. And I'd kind of get my tripod out, I'd set up a shot, check my exposure, I'd check my composition, and then all of a sudden I'd look up and there were two other photographers taking exactly the same shot and setting up for exactly the same stuff with pretty much the same gear. And it was at that point that I kind of became a bit disillusioned. I've always thought of myself as a fairly creative person, but I've never really, until compositing came along, I've never really found an outlet for that creativity. I'm a useless musician. I can't dance, I can't paint. So photography, from the start, I was kind of hoping that it was going to be this this outlet for my creativity. And luckily, about the point that I became quite quickly fed up with how difficult it was to be original, and it gave me a real fresh perspective and respect for all photographers, really, finding that out. I discovered layer masks in Photoshop, which pretty much overnight changed everything, because all of a sudden I discovered that the bounds of possibilities were just in my mind, not purely location, not purely the places that I could visit. I could change those locations, and I could make unlimited decisions on what I want those images to look like.
So at this point, and first of all, let me go back. You said you've only been photographing since like 2010?
Yeah.
Wow. So when you move into this understanding layer masks, it immediately clicked compositing. But again, a lot of people understand layer masks and don't do compositing well. We've all seen those images online. So when you made this when the light bulb went off in your head, is a good way to word it, right? You're walking down the street and you suddenly realize layer masks exist, and you see ocean, mountain. Hey, let's combine the two. I'm assuming though at that point there was a pretty big learning curve, even if you knew Photoshop, to get good at combining.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'd say my first 100 attempts at any kind of composite was awful. I was replacing horrible, wet London streets with, tropical blue skies that made no sense because the shadows didn't work and, the light, they were awful. But over time, those images become slightly better, as with any other kind of photography, I guess. And lots of weekends spent practicing and going out and obviously taking my own photos and using my own assets, but also to speed up the process of practice, I'd use stock images, or I'd use any other kinds of images I could get my hands on to learn kind of the tricks of the trade. I mean, it's interesting that you say light bulb moments, because I've been asked a few times, when was a light bulb moment for so-and-so image? And the truth is, I don't know what it's like for anybody else in the creative fields, but I personally have never had what you'd call a light bulb moment. All my ideas and all my images come from a process of iteration of weeks or months, really. If I have an outline of an idea, it's really quite tempting a lot of the time to try and act on that idea and to get to work straight away, to go and head into the mountain to collect the edits or wherever I might need to go to make an image. But I try and fight that urge as much as possible, because I know that an idea typically strengthens over time. And the more you think about it, the more you think about locations for it, the more you think about what kind of light you might like, all those kinds of things. So it's always tempting to act on any idea that you have straight away. But I do like to kind of let ideas cook for as long as I think they possibly can.
So if you haven't had a light bulb moment and you assemble these over a long period of time with multiple iterations, was there wasn't even a light bulb moment as you were doing iterations where it was like, yeah, I can do this? I mean, was it all experimentation at first and there was a point where you realized, yeah, this is what I'm meant to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, with any given image, a lot of the time, it's typically, I say process of iteration and being patient, but there always comes a point where you think now's the time. If I don't start work on it now, I'll get completely bored of the idea and I want to move on to something else. And typically when you do that, the first stage of gathering assets never really goes to plan. Either you don't get the weather, you don't get the location quite right, there's a roadblock in the portion of a street that you want to shoot, all those kinds of things. And so an idea typically strengthens as you go through kind of the stage 2, 3, 4, and 5 of trying to grab the assets too.
Trying to tweak it, which, and I've told this story before, and on the TWiP episode, or a recent something I did with Frederick and my friend Troy Miller, we discussed this one issue where Renee Robin, who's an amazing composite artist, had looked at one of Troy's pictures and immediately went, "Oh, you swapped out the sky." I mean, literally, she grabbed the phone and within 2 seconds, "Oh, you swapped out the sky." And he was like, maybe. But she immediately saw what you're talking about, which is why I want to really get into this shot today, because you've got that ability, looking at this shot, to describe to people how to improve their composite photography. And a lot of it is what you just said, that iteration process that you go through. So let's bring the shot up. The name of the shot is Zone 334. Explain that to me.
Yeah, so for anyone that's ever been to London, the chances are that you spent your time, or a big percentage of your time in London, on the Underground network or on some version of the public transport in London. The public transport in London, as far as I'm concerned, is brilliant to a point where it makes absolutely no sense to own a car.
I've been there, and I've got to agree. There's nothing I've ever been on anywhere like the Tube. Yeah,
it's fantastic. I mean, it's not, you do have your gripes. It's not air conditioned, and at rush hour, it's really not pleasant at all. But basically, the fare system is split into, I think, 9 zones. So you start in central London, which is zone 1. Then if you go out to zone 2, that'll cost you a little bit more money. And it goes all the way to zone 9, which is sort of probably an hour and a half outside of central London. And the idea behind zone 334 is basically that I grew up in Wales, which is probably, as the crow flies, 250 miles from London. And I used to go home a fair amount, both to shoot and to see my parents, see other members of family, see some friends. And as I say, the transport system in London is fantastic until you have lots of luggage. I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, to drag 3 suitcases through the hot, stuffy Victorian tunnels of the Tube, and then to have to get on 2 buses all to get to the train station where you get your train, 250 miles or wherever you happen to be going in the country. So the idea, or the name of Zone 334, came from a concept of wishing that the Tube just went on forever, and that you could get on with your 3 suitcases and not have to get off, not have to change 3 trains and 2 buses to get to your destination. So, I mean, if that was a reality, it would still be horrible. The Tube is a loud, dark, slow journey, but it would probably, I think, be a bit more bearable than trying to lug, 50, 60 pounds up flights of stairs to rush to get your next train.
Well, and that's the thing. The Tube is fantastic if you're already in London and you want to go somewhere. But if you land at Heathrow and you've got luggage and you need to get to a hotel, inevitably you're going to be walking down city streets pulling luggage behind you, sometimes for a little bit of time. I totally get what you mean. So this image, obviously composite, right? You've got the underground tunnel going in and you're in the mountains. Where is this background at?
So this is a place in Snowdonia National Park in the north of Wales. It's a beautiful national park. It's got some of the UK's highest mountains. I mean, on the worldwide scene, they don't really scratch the surface, but they're kind of, the highest peaks are 3,000-4,000 feet. So they're not tiny, but they're not big by any measure. But the scenery is incredible. And this shot was taken just near a lake called Lake Cravnant. And to be honest, the backstory to the background image here couldn't be more boring. I mean, it was a nice spring walk, and I kind of just happened across the scene. And as far as gathering background images goes, I mean, this example was an example of an image that I had a rough idea for before I started it. So typically half the time, if I see a nice looking kind of scene that I think would be good for a composite, then I'll shoot it without necessarily having an idea.
Almost to build your own stock library.
Absolutely, yeah. In this case, I did have an idea in mind. But regardless of whether you do or you don't have an idea in mind for any kind of background image, it's important to take a number of exposures, a number of different focal lengths, and try and kind of tweak the compositions as you do it, because you want your library to be as full as possible, and to be as flexible as possible. You know, the last thing you want is to have a brilliant background image and you can't use it because for whatever reason you want to place some kind of object in the middle of it, and you don't have the right focal length, or you've overexposed a shot, or you've not focused on the right point.
See, that's interesting to me, because I know people who do that, right? They're I'm going to need that texture, or I'm going to need that background. It never hit me that you get it and it's like, oh, I'm going to use this someday. And then you pull it up and it doesn't match the compression, the whatever of shooting it. So you carry multiple lenses with you just to be safe.
Absolutely.
Or a single zoom and you zoom in and out. Yeah,
so typically my go-to would be something like a 24-70, and typically what I would do is shoot a picture on all the marked points of the lens. So, you know, 24, 35, 50, 70. I'd then kind of make sure that I was focused on a number of parts in the scene for each of those focal lengths, and I'd probably bracket for good measure to make sure that I wasn't blowing any highlights.
So at 24, you'll shoot multiple brackets. And at 24, you'll shoot multiple focal depths.
Absolutely.
So you could end up just at 24 with 10 shots, and then at 34, 10 shots, and then at 70, 10 shots, so that you've got a wide selection of background. Do you know your exposure on this background by chance?
That's a good question.
If you don't, it's no big deal.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it would have been typically I aim to have a aperture around f8, because I don't want really shallow depths of field, particularly when I don't know what kind of subject I'm going to be sticking in the middle of a scene. Do you tend to expose dead on? Do you tend to underexpose to give you leeway? Well, that's where the bracketing comes in. Typically a lot of the time, particularly in recent images, I've got more into luminosity masks, which is basically HDR, but taking more control of the process yourself in Photoshop, and having more control over what's blended and how it's blended and how strong the effect is. So,
and what body do you shoot?
So this image in particular, this was taken back in, I want to say 2014, 2015 on an original Olympus OMD EM5. And I think for this shot, actually, I would have had a number of primes with me, because this particular shot was on a Pancake 20mm f1.7 lens. So altogether, it was probably, as a system, weighed no more than a standard compact or point and shoot, really. Is that what you shoot now, Olympus? No, so now, I'm in the process of transitioning back to Micro Four Thirds from Nikon FX. Okay, all right. So it's been I've kind of meandered through many systems like a lot of photographers have, and I'm going back to Micro Four Thirds just because the bodies, I think, have come on leaps and bounds in the last few years, and so have the lenses too. And now that weather sealing is available across bodies and lenses, having the option to be able to lug an enormous amount of gear up a mountain without really doing your back any harm is very appealing to me. And I typically don't shoot often in low light for the kind of thing I do, so the sensor size has never really worried me too much either. So I think I've got a friend who hikes in this area periodically, because I see him put pictures up there, Anthony D'Angio. And based on his pictures, beautiful area. But that brings us to the main subject matter. Yeah. You've got in the middle of nowhere in Wales, a London subway tunnel.
And the detail in this subway tunnel is killer. I mean, you can zoom in and you can read the sign. It's just amazing what you did with that. Was this shot at the same time with the same camera? Was it shot at a different time? Do you worry, if you shot the other one on the OMD and you shot this one on a 70 to 200, Nikon D5, does that matter to you?
So typically the only things that matter are the elements of an image that make a composite work are perspective and type and direction of light. So perspective is hugely important. The angle of your camera, the focal length, those kinds of things really make a difference. And
regardless of whether it's full frame, micro four thirds, doesn't matter as long as the effective focal length and stuff kind of pair up.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a number of years now, I've kind of been shooting both on micro four thirds and full frame. So as long as you have the effective focal lengths in mind, it's never too much of an issue. But yeah, perspective is hugely important, but also the type and direction of light is massive. If you have soft light in one image and hard light in another, it won't look realistic. And if you have, the sun beaming from the left of an image in one of the images and coming from completely the opposite direction in another, it just won't look. The shadows will look odd. Your mind is, regardless of your experience at looking at pictures, we've all been hugely experienced in looking at images through life and our our exposure to media. And so very quickly, you pick up on something that doesn't look particularly natural. For the tube image, I don't know if I mentioned that the background image in Wales I took around Easter time. I think it was, I guess early spring. For the tube image, I had to wait until pretty much the middle of summer of that same year, because as anyone that's been to London will know, getting an image of a tube station like that doesn't have direct sunlight hitting it, but also isn't full of people is a bit of a challenge. So I had two options really. I could go of an evening or maybe a weekend morning to the tube station, set up a tripod and take 100 exposures and try and blend out all the people that would inevitably be entering the station or leaving.
And then correcting the light.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Or what I chose to do was wait till the height of summer, get up at sort of 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning, to the station for sunrise, which I think that time of year is probably 5:30 a.m. and wait for people not to be in the way of the shot. And there are still a fair few people around in central London at 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning. I guess for some people it's still Saturday night, so you see some sights, I can tell you. So that gave me entertainment while I was waiting for the right light.
Well, but okay, that's interesting. So first of all, let me ask this. In this foreground subway tunnel, were there people that you had to clone out, or were you able to get the shot like it sits here?
Yeah, I was able to get the shot, luckily. I mean, I still had to bide my time. But, realistically, in a city like London, that is pretty much the only time of day on the only day of the week, Sunday, at the only time of year that I could have got that shot. When
you shot this, did you have it in your head that you were going to put it in this background?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So by this time, the idea had kind of come to fruition, and I'd realized that I'd have to wait a couple more months in order to get that shot.
So you go see, and here's what's interesting to me. Okay. So, because you walk around London and there's tube tunnels everywhere, right? Tube entrances everywhere. But it's that matching of the light. So, okay, it's 5:30 in the morning and it's sunrise, but the sun has to be coming from an angle, because you're going to drop this into this grass facing you. It does you no good to take the picture of the back of a tube station. So, you're going to face it this way. You can see which way the light is going in the background, which is really nicely diffused from those clouds. By the way, the background are the clouds substituted?
No, the clouds are real. The clouds are there.
Beautiful, then. Absolutely beautiful. So do you walk around London going, which tube station is going to be pointing down the street in the right direction so that when the light comes up, it hits it from this angle? Or you know what I mean?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I got somewhat lucky with the background shot in that, as you say, it was a reasonably blue sky day, certainly for Wales, but there were clouds about, and I was shooting at a time when the sun was behind the clouds, which meant there was really, really soft light because some of those clouds were really quite heavy. And that meant that I could kind of take my pick of any scenario in London where I found soft light on a tube station, which
right.
I knew would be the case at kind of 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning because the sun wouldn't have got over the buildings. So I was essentially shooting in the shade of the buildings, but there was still enough light there to make it look realistic. There was no harsh shadows from sunlight in either of the images, which made it possible to kind of create a realistic image. If you're having to deal with really harsh shadows from sunlight, then automatically you're making quite a lot of work for yourself.
Right, which makes sense. But when you go into the streets of London and you're setting up and you've already got the picture in your head, I'm going to drop this into this landscape. How do you remember? I mean, do you have notes going, light needs to be coming from this angle? Do you just remember it in your head? Do you have the photo on your phone so that you can look at a tube station, hold your phone up and kind of go, yeah, that will work?
I always have. So of those images that I've taken, a version of every single focal length on my phone. So I can kind of flick through them, and by eye, I can kind of assess whether or not it's going to work or not. And it takes some time and some practice to kind of get the hang of whether it will work or not. And you can use references along the frames, kind of work out where things are going to sit in the frame. Certainly take some practice. I mean, I've possible to create some kind of app or something to almost overlay Finder on top of an image that you've previously taken, because that would make things
that would be nice easier. That would be almost like a live green screen, blue screen effect. So
that would.
You mentioned layer masks in Photoshop. So obviously you're doing your composites in Photoshop. Is that the only app that you use in post?
I use Lightroom as well. So I'll go into Lightroom first, or sometimes Camera Raw, and just make basic corrections before I start compositing. Typically the image when I've started compositing doesn't really look like the final image in terms of, I haven't done any kind of, quite often I haven't even corrected white balance or anything like that. But I've corrected things like distortions, and I've removed things like.
Then the color correction is. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. And then when I'm when I finished in Photoshop, I can go into Lightroom and work on the images a single layer, and kind of enhance any other colors that I need to that I haven't done in Photoshop. And the reason that I don't want to go too heavy in Lightroom with the individual images before I get to Photoshop is that I want to make sure I've got a kind of almost a blank canvas in terms of color, because the color correction of the individual images needs to be matched quite closely between the images, and it's just much easier to do that when you're working with layers in Photoshop. Which was
the question I was about to ask. And that is whether you get the same kind of light, meaning soft, hard, whatever, color temperature isn't going to match between this hillside and downtown London. So how do you match the tone, white balance, color? How do you do that? I mean, the helicopter view, obviously you can't teach it right now, but you know what I mean. What's your helicopter approach to getting the colors of two composite images, whether they be a subway station in this, or you took a studio shot of somebody on a seamless white background and you lit them a certain way to try and match this, and you want to drop them into the field? Yeah,
so it's the beauty of adjustment layers in Photoshop, and within those, so I'll typically say we've got an image like this, which primarily is comprised of two basic images. You've got the background, which is the mountains and the hills, and you've also got the tube station. And between those layers, I will basically have a load of adjustment layers, which are only affecting what's below them. So they'll only be affecting the background image. And then on top of the tube station image, I'll have a load of adjustment layers that will be clipped to the tube image. and therefore they will only be affecting the tube image. And therefore you can make adjustments with color, saturation, the tone curve, all kinds of things on a layer by layer basis.
Is that generally what you use, is color, saturation, tone curve, or do you just go to tone curve on different channels?
Sometimes it really depends. I'm still very much in a process of experimenting, to be honest. I wouldn't say I've settled on any kind of workflow in terms of really delving into Photoshop, just because different things seem to work in different situations. You know, sometimes I can get away with having one adjustment layer for each layer, and that might be, you know, levels, or it might be, you know, brightness or contrast. Other times I'll have kind of 10, 11, 12 adjustment layers for each image. It really depends, and it really depends how good a job I've done in the field as well. You know, if I've been in a rush, I might not have exposed correctly for some images. If the scene has been time dependent, you know, if I can see the sun's about to come out, or there's a subject going to be kind of walking past the frame, or whatever it might be. If I'm in a rush, typically what that leads to is more work in post.
And most of your images, unlike some people that do, you know, very artsy fantasy worlds where they can color anything what they want, yours are all, or at least most that I've seen, are real world scenes, the Big Ben, you know, something like that, attire, that need to have some reality in their color, so that matching is critical. I mean, almost like product photography, because so many people have seen Big Ben or the red and blue on an underground station. So imagine for me, if you would, you're standing on a stage in front of a bunch of people, and someone raises their hand and says, "I've never done composites. What's your one tip that will get me started and not be frustrated?" Because when I look at this picture, one of the things that immediately hits me about compositing, obviously, is masking, right? Layer masks is what we kind of started this conversation with. And if you zoom in on this picture, you must have painstakingly, pixel by pixel, gone in and masked this, because the grass comes up in front of the tube station. You can see the grass through the wrought iron bars. I mean, the detail with which you cut that train station out and dropped it into this background and blended the background in with it with grass wheat is amazing. So this person in the audience says, "I want to try doing this. I want to do my experimentation. What checkbox would you give me to make it easier on myself and get me started?"
I'd probably say one thing for each of the 3 steps of the process. So the first step is the idea. And I think I've already talked about the process of iteration, kind of letting an idea cook, basically. You know, when you have an idea, understand that over a process of weeks of you kind of thinking about that in the shower or on the way to work or wherever it might be, that idea inevitably will get struck. When you do move into grabbing the assets, do your best to kind of get hold of as many perspectives as you possibly can, to make sure that when you go into the editing stage, you've got all that you need. It's just a case of finding them and matching them together. And then when you get into editing, and I think this is true of all kinds of photography, not just compositing, I think it's important when you're working with an image to tackle it in kind of small chunks of time. You know, I think we've all spent hours in front of a computer in Lightroom editing an image without realizing that over that period of time, you're becoming a bit numb to it, and you're not seeing it in the same way that somebody who's seeing it for the first time would see it. So you can go way too far with the color, or you might change it beyond recognition without even realizing it, just because you've been pushing sliders and changing layers and all sorts of things for too long. So I'd say with editing, it's important that every hour that you might be sat editing an image, that you give yourself some time away from the screen, so that every so often you can come back to the computer with a fresh pair of eyes. Otherwise, you might end up with a result that doesn't look realistic. And at the end of the day, certainly with my work, that's always the goal.
Interesting. I wish I could do what you do, But for me, the biggest part is the vision. You're looking through your portfolio. I see stuff that I just am like, I can't believe I didn't think of it, but I just don't see it until I see it. I mean, you're one with the London Eye as the wheel. I dig that shot. And the other one is your Wi-Fi image, which I don't even have to describe it. Trust me. If you go to James's website, you'll know it immediately. First of all, I think it's one of the early ones in the portfolio, but it's just this hand reaching wantingly for a Wi-Fi image that's made of clouds. I love it. It's absolutely brilliant what you do. If people want to see your work, where do they go?
Yeah, so they can head over to jamespopsys.com and they can find links there to, the usual places. I'm on Instagram, and in the last year or so, I've started a YouTube channel, which I'm really enjoying. So on there, I tackle things like gear reviews, and I do bits and bobs of tutorials as well. And then on other videos, I'll be gallivanting around trying to hunt for images for concepts. So yeah, I cover a variety of things on YouTube, mostly about photography, and sometimes about my stupid decisions and mistakes too. So yeah.
Which is actually how people can really learn. I mean, you're going to learn a lot from somebody else sharing where they went wrong. That's one of the best lessons. So it's jamespopsys.com. Right. Facebook and YouTube, it's James Popsys Photo. Instagram and Twitter, it's just James Popsys. And James, I can't say thanks enough, man. I really appreciate your stopping by and sharing some knowledge with us.
Me too. Thank you very much for having me, Steve. It's been good fun.
Yeah, it definitely has. So again, I'm your host, Steve Brazel. This is Behind the Shot, the show where we try and get inside the mind of great photographers by taking a closer look behind one of their shots. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me on social media. It's pretty much Steve Brazel everywhere except Facebook. It's Steve Brazel Photography. But the easiest way is you can go to thisweekinphoto.com, use the contact page there, click the link for Behind the Shot there. You can subscribe to the podcast. And then if you do, make sure you drop us a review in iTunes or something as well. And all our past episodes are on This Week in Photo as well. Until next time, we'll see you.
Hey there, I'm Frederick Van Johnson. Thanks for checking out the TWiP Network on YouTube. If you'd like to keep up to date with the shows we're putting out, be sure to click subscribe. And while you're at it, give us a thumbs up. You can also subscribe on thisweekinphoto.com, where you'll find lots of other great photography shows. Thanks for watching the TWiP Network on YouTube.